Welcome to this seminar, which is titled Quo Vadis, Belarus, which commemorates 3 years after the popular protest and the stealing of the presidential election in Belarus. This is the second online conference of the Belarus Research Network for Neighborhood Policy, which is funded by the Nordic Council of Ministers. But since the August 2020 protest, which has marked some of the bloodiest chapter of the Belarusian history since the collapse of the Berlin Wall, and has changed the geopolitical landscape of Europe drastically. And Belarus is now viewed by the West as part of a Russian hemisphere and a sort of a district of Russia to some degree, but not totally. And in order to represent the Belarusian resistance and delegitimize the occupation of the country by Russia, the opposition forces have set up institutions in exile to give people of Belarus hope for a different future and the world a choice to support the uniting forces against Lukashenka. So in this conference, we will ask, what is the status at the moment? How is it actually, what are we seeing both internally in Belarus as well as externally in terms of the opposition? How are they organizing? And for this, I'm really, really pleased to welcome Pavel Latushka, who is a former Belarusian politician and diplomat, but also today a member of the Coordination Council and in charge of the transition, or in charge of organizing or planning the transition to democracy when time comes. So please, Pavel Latushka, I know your time is short, and I'm very pleased to see you here at this webinar, and I will give you the word for a 15 minutes presentation on how you see the situation at the moment. If I can, I would like to ask some questions in the end.
Thank you so much. So ladies and gentlemen, good evening. It's very important. I'm very pleased to see you, to participate in this seminar. I'd like to inform you that I am not more a member of the Coordination Council. I'm Deputy Head of United Transitional Cabinet, responsible for the transit in our United Democratic Forces. And but what I want to tell you after 3 years. The situation in Belarus should be assessed in the context of the current situation in the entire region, because right now, in the center of Europe, not one but two imperialist wars in Russia are having place. Russia's war against a free and independent Ukraine, and Russia's war against a free and independent Belarus. The first thing we need to understand is that in both wars, the pro-Kremlin puppet regime of Lukashenka is on the side of Russia. But there are those who fight for Belarus. There are the Belarusian democratic forces, and these are the Belarusian volunteer formations in Ukraine. And just like the authorities and the army of Ukraine, we need active allies with a strategy. Yes, there is no fighting in our territory of Belarus right now. Russia's takeover of Belarus is different. This is a hybrid war, the so-called non-military occupation, which Russia spends huge resources on. Russia spends billions to keep the puppet regime of Lukashenka in power to ensure mass repressions carried out by him, which do not stop for a single day. Russia spends billions on the implementation of integration programs of the Union State, the project to absorb Belarus, to destroy the national identity of Belarusians and change the people's mindset in the spirit of the ideas of the Russian world. This means that the second thing we need to understand is that we need to significantly increase the potential of the national-oriented, pro-European Belarusian democratic forces in the fight against Russia and pro-Russian forces in Belarus. Unfortunately, today Russia is the only country that has a strategy for Belarus. strategy of absorption of Belarus in the framework of the Union State project and its dissolution in the Russian world. And the puppet regime of Lukashenko is the conductor of this strategy in Belarus. This is a sad thing to understand. Lukashenko is not the one to find common ground with, not someone who cares about its national interests. He provides this by becoming an accomplice to the war against Ukraine in 2022 and continues to prove it today by participating in Russian war crimes, deporting Ukrainian children from the occupied territories, deploying Russian nuclear weapons and Wagner Group in Belarus, and destroying everything Belarusian. Today, we see Belarus on the edge of complete loss of sovereignty and independence. One of the actual problems today is the Wagner Group in Belarus. When Prigozhin's campaign started, it was a tactical success for Lukashenko. He tried to sell himself to the Russian society as a savior, but in fact, it was a strategic failure of the dictator, as he loses his power and control with the deployment of the Wagner Group in Belarus. Wagner is a danger of the country's sovereignty, and Russia is using it as a tool to escalate the situation on the borders with NATO, to at least force countries to sit down at the negotiating table to resolve the conflict in Ukraine on Russia's terms, and at most to destabilize the situation through provocations on NATO's borders and to reduce military aid to Ukraine as it will be needed by Poland or Lithuania. De facto, sovereignty and independence have already been largely lost in my country. And today we should no longer talk about protecting them, but about restoring them. We Belarusians do not give up and continue to fight. After all, the war of the Russian world against the democratic world is not over yet. In this war, we have allies, but our allies are passive. And unlike our enemy, our allies have no strategy. I say this as a politician of a country that is dying before everyone's eyes and clearly understands that diplomacy and silence cannot save it. After all, if we are talking about a strategy, the strategy of winning the battle for Belarus, we must base it on objective reality. But the reality is that the battle for Belarus is on several fronts at once. And in each of them, Russia and its puppet Lukashenko have a significant advantage. Therefore, the strategy I am talking about is the strategy of building up the potential of the Belarusian democratic forces in our battle for Belarus with the Russian world. On each of the fronts, informational, ideological, and civil, cultural, economic, political, and geopolitical. If we talk about the information front, here we see the total control of the Lukashenko's regime and the Kremlin over the press inside the country. Belarusians are simultaneously under the increasing influence of state propaganda and the Russian media. Within the framework of the Union State of Russia and Belarus, a single media holding is being created, for which billions are allocated from the Union State budget. At the same time, all independent media that worked in Belarus until 2020 were crushed and forced out of the country, and all their channels and materials in social networks are recognized as extremist. Belarusians face criminal prosecution for distributing and even subscribing to independent media or on social networks. Western media, previously popular with the Belarusian audience, also became excluded from the television broadcasting. In addition, Western media are generally not very interested in the Belarusian audience, which is a mistake. In the absence of an alternative, the Belarusian audience is left alone with pro-Russian propaganda. Thus, on the information front, we need to solve two tasks. First, significantly increase support for Belarus independent media. And second, Western media should develop a media strategy for the Belarusian audience and not just include it in the Western informational space, but also create channels, programs, and control aimed specifically at Belarusians. Analyzing the ideological and civil front, it can be stated that by 2020, the Belarusian civil society is practically defeated. All NGOs, non-governmental organizations, and communities that do not share the ideology of the Lukashenka regime have been destroyed and thrown away from Belarus. At the moment, there are no completely safe forms of self-organization or association of citizens in Belarus, unless they are openly pro-regime and pro-Russian and are under 100% state control. Our goal is to increase support for the civil society. First of all, projects aimed at preserving national identity, language, culture, and developing national identity, as opposed to the pro-Russian one. The situation is the same on the cultural front. National culture inside Belarus is being destroyed and actively replaced by Russian. Therefore, the task of the cultural front is also to maximize support for the Belarusian culture in exile, to create conditions for its preservation, development, and popularization. We cannot lose it. After all, culture is the foundation of a nation. If we talk about the economic front, the main problem is that the sanctions imposed on the Lukashenko regime and on Russia are still not harmonized. Given the existence of a single economic space, in fact, a single economy of Russia and Belarus within the Union state, the lack of harmonization of sanctions against both countries actually turns Belarus into a gray zone and an offshore zone for bypassing sanctions. It is important to understand the role of Belarus in the economic system of the Union state. The military-industrial complex of Belarus is the military-industrial complex of Russia. The economy of Belarus is a de facto part of the economy of the Union state and, in fact, the economy of Russia. But the Lukashenko regime not only participates in the war against Ukraine, commits war crimes, but also does not stop mass repressions and crimes against humanity against Belarusians. At the same time, Russia continues to sponsor the regime. Thus, the tasks that need to be solved are: first, strengthen and fully harmonize sanctions against Russia and the Lukashenko regime in Belarus. Second, introduce the strictest control over the sanctions and start pushing them harshly. And third, make sponsoring the Lukashenko regime as expensive as possible for Russia. We managed to make some progress in the adoption of a new package of European Union sanctions. There was a partial harmonization of sanctions and no exemptions were made for Belarusian potash. But these successes need to be developed quickly and economic pressure must become a shock level. As for the political front, apart from Lukashenko himself, we can say that a number of representatives of the so-called elites, including the military, are also pro-Russian. The preservation of power for this part of the elite, even in case of incapacity of death of Lukashenko, was fixed even at the level of the constitution. But in the democratic Belarus, as we see it, those who committed the crimes must be held accountable. But it will be decided by a fair court. At the same time, those officials who have not committed crimes and their competence corresponds to their positions will be able to continue working. Those who hold their position on the basis of loyalty to the regime will not be able to keep working in the official bodies. But it is also important for us to show that the responsibility is already being imposed today on those who have committed and are committing crimes in Belarus. The arrest warrant for Lukashenko for war crimes, responsibility within the framework of universal jurisdiction for torture and crimes in Belarus. This is what we have been waiting for from Western partners for 3 years. Today, we are creating alternative institution of power. Svetlana Tikhanovskaya is the elected president. She created the United Transitional Cabinet as an executive body of democratic forces. The members of the cabinet have passed the approval procedure in the Coordination Council. The Coordination Council should go through elections of its members next year. Yes, the cabinet currently operates in exile, but it is important not to forget that Lukashenko regime is illegitimate and illegal, while the legitimacy Svetlana Tikhanovskaya is recognized by most countries of the civilized world. Thus, the goals on the political fronts are as follows. First, recognize the United Transitional Cabinet of Belarus as a legitimate authority representing Belarus. Second, provide the cabinet with all necessary support to free Belarus from the Lukashenko regime and Russian control, to ensure independence and European perspectives for Belarus. But perhaps it is on the geopolitical front that the fate of Belarus will be decided. Will it become a de facto part of Russia, finally dissolving into the Union state, or will it receive a European perspective of development, the proposal of joining the European Union and NATO? In fact, everything I said above boils down to a simple question. What kind of Belarus do you want to see tomorrow? Russian Belarusia or European Belarus? And if the answer is a European Belarus, then all the tasks I mentioned above should form the basis of our common strategy. Without Belarus, Russia's imperial projects become impossible. Even the continuation of the war against Ukraine is becoming impossible, because the war against Ukraine is waged not by Russia alone, but by the Union State of Russia and Belarus, in which Belarus is involved only because there is a regime of Lukashenko, while the Union State exists only because it includes Belarus. Here is the winning strategy I propose today in one sentence. Abolish the Lukashenko regime, abolish the Union State. But to implement this strategy, the potential of the democratic forces must become comparable to the potential of the regime and pro-Russian forces in Belarus. Our capabilities and key 3 forces to achieve this goal are: internal, underground civil society movement; external, volunteer formation in Ukraine; and international, pressure on the Lukashenko regime, recognition and support of the democratic forces and the cabinet must be multiplied. Belarusian society is passing the exam, and this is our responsibility, of course. But European society is also passing the exam, to be able to help the European people to defeat tyranny. I believe in consolidation of our forces and our common victory. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. I think it was a very clear strategy, and a lot of the questions that I had actually prepared beforehand, you kind of mentioned, especially the fact that there, is the strategy, the EU strategy on Belarus, is it sufficient and is it right? And I think you clearly answered that it's not, and that it doesn't reach far enough, that it's a sort of a passive strategy and not an active strategy. But first of all, I think I'd just like to mention, go to something that you actually launched today, the fact that you are launching a specific passport for Belarusian citizens. Could you explain a bit about the importance of this passport and how it actually, you can actually use this fact as part of you could say, creating this governmental opposite or another structure of a Belarusian society that actually opposes Lukashenko?
It's a very big problem for Belarusians in exile, Belarusian diaspora, to have legal documents to live here in European and other countries of the world because of the huge repressions they designed to change the place of living. It was not the choice of Belarusians. It was the result of the massive repression in Belarus. Of course, it's also a problem in communication, in context with Lukashenko's embassies and consulates abroad. They're using instrument of documents, of passports, to control Belarusian people, to create pressure out of the country on them, to initiate contacts and initiate for Belarusian the idea to come back at home. And when Belarusian people will go at home, they will be punished, they will be arrested, and they will be sentenced in Belarus. So the risk of using of documents, the instruments of documentization for Belarusian people, the risk to be punished using these documents is so huge, is so big. That is why we decided to create a passport, Belarusian passport abroad, which will be issued by the United Transitional Cabinet as a representative body of the Belarusian society abroad in exile. In history, we had such examples. We had in our history of Belarus in 1918 or last century, when it was Belarusian People's Republic, and Belarusian People's Republic also issued their documents, issued their passports. It's for the travel matters today, it's for matters of legalization. It is also for motivation of people. I'm sure that many of Belarusians want to have such document which will be proof, which with approval for that we are citizens of democratic country. The question of recognition of these documents is very important. We are in contact with some countries. I cannot mention in public the names of these countries, but we have now some positive reactions from several countries. It will be bilateral negotiations between our United Transitional Cabinet and these governments of the countries. We will see the effects. I'm sure that they will be positive, but it's necessary to do also a job from our side.
So it also, I guess, it represents a kind of a alternative citizenship as being a citizen of a democratic Belarus, as opposed to being a citizen of a repressive Lukashenko type, or.
In some way, yes, but factually no, because I will be a citizen of Belarus. And in the future, we know that Lukashenko want to
Decide?
Yes, of citizen for Belarusian people abroad. So for me personally, it will be a legal document for the future. But I'm now a citizen of Belarus, and I want to be in the future citizen of Belarus.
Some of the, there's discussions on whether there should be sort of armed resistance against the Lukashenko regime, also within the people in opposition. And now you have people fighting in Ukraine, which ultimately wants to see the overthrow of the Lukashenko regime, also even if violence. How do you see that? You could say the is that actually what we are going towards, and how do we and how does you could say the EU, NATO, how do we actually what should we actually say on this? What should be our stance on this?
Only dictators want war. Putin wants war. Lukashenka wants war. Stupid people, they want war. We absolutely don't want. And our idea, our goal to realize peaceful scenarios of changes in our country. But I am absolutely understand, and I'm absolutely realistic that now we have great threat for our existence of our state, sovereignty, and existence of Belarusian nation. We understand that now we have enemy in the territory of Belarus. This enemy is Russian Federation. They occupied Belarus non-military way. They want to have Belarus as a part of Russian Federation. It's a question of time when it will happen. Tomorrow, after tomorrow, we'll wait 1 year, 3 years. And in such situation, of course, it's very important to be ready to use all instruments. But today, of course, we don't want to have such scenario. We don't have any ideas or plans to realize it today. But to show Lukashenko's regime that we have the force inside, our activists inside, in underground movement is the first force, as I said. The second force, it is our regiments in the Ukrainian army. Our heroes, they are struggling now, they are fighting now for the freedom of Ukraine. But their dream is, of course, to free Belarus. And to show this force for regime, it's also very important instrument of pressure. The said instrument, the said force, as I said you, is support of international society, international community, to use all legal methods, to use sanctions policy, more effective sanction policy. It's also to create a pressure from outside of Belarus. But it will be a crucial moment for Belarusian society. And for that crucial moment, it's very important to have a control on the territory of Belarus. Which way we can have this control? First, we need to have activists inside. The second, we need to have forces outside. And we need to have institutions. As I mentioned, we have elected president, we have executive body, United Transitional Cabinet, which I'm representing here, and Coordination Council, like a proto-parliamentary structure. So again, we don't want to have any civil war, any real war in our country, but force in our strategy, it is very important to create this force and to show for regime that we have this force.
Mr. Pavel Latushka, thank you so much for giving this very interesting presentation, and I'm sure that we will try to distribute it as far as possible that we can, so that your message comes through. Thank you. I know you have to run, so I just want to say thank you for your.
Thank you so much for your invitation and for your attention, for your focus to Belarus. Thank you.
Bye-bye. Good luck. And then now I'm happy to introduce to you Margot, and I'm just struggling a bit with your last name, but I'll try again. It's Margot Rucheva, I hope I said it right, who is the president of the Belarusian National Council, Youth Council, the Rada, which is a voluntary union of 38 youth organizations. And I'm really excited and interested in hearing what you're saying, as you also represent the future of Belarus and what is actually the spirit among the young people. But without further ado, I'll give the word to you, Margot.
Thank you so much. Maybe just a quick addition that I'm also part of the coordination council that Mr. Pavlovishko was a part of a couple of months ago. And I was recently also elected as or let's say more of appointed as an advisor on youth policy and students to Slantanovka. So from this perspective, I can also bring some of the information about what is happening with the youth organizations and youth in general in Belarus and outside of Belarus. And this would probably be the first, let's say, distinguishing that we need to make when speaking about Belarusian youth is that the groups of young people that are inside of Belarus and outside of Belarus are drastically different at the moment because they face different situations, they face different circumstances and different problems on the way to being fully engaged in political process or in the life of our society. So if you can imagine, like, for example, the people that are staying in Belarus, the young people in general, activists, volunteers, youth organizations are facing a tremendous amount of pressure from the government. In 2021, we've had a massive shutdown of organizations when more than 1,300 organizations have been liquidated. And now it's illegal for people to be, not only for young people, but in general for activists to be a part of organizations that is either liquidated or unregistered, and you can be sentenced up to 5 years in prison for just being a part of an organization that is not recognized by the regime. So this is one of the implications that our activists are facing in Belarus. The other one is, of course, the fear of being ending up in prison for their activities. We have 1,600 political prisoners at the moment, and Rada has been conducting and is still kind of updating the database of political prisoners that are young, and more than about 50% of the political prisoners, of all the political prisoners in the country, are youth, which is a very shocking and non-optimistic number, let's say. So the young people that are in Belarus are facing all of this fear and let's say lack of. I've seen a lot of young people in Belarus being very disconnected from what is happening outside of Belarus because of lack of the possibility to connect with them, lack of the possibility to educate them on what is happening outside of Belarus and how we are trying to fight for the Belarusians inside of the country. So there also is a lack of, let's say, a dropping motivation in young people to resist as much as they did a few years ago, because time passes. And for example, we can imagine that people that are, let's say, 18 at the moment, 3 years ago, they were 15, and probably they were not that involved in the protests. So for them, it's getting harder and harder to understand what has happened 3 years ago and what is happening at the moment. And you can also imagine that with the amount of propaganda that is being kind of influencing the understanding of young people in Belarus, it's harder for them to also kind of grasp what is happening in the country. And I remember myself being a young person in Belarus, I was also not understanding what is happening and what the regime is doing to the Belarusians in Belarus for most of my life. And for me, it was also kind of difficult to go through the propaganda and to actually understand what is happening. So we face this gap as well with the Belarusians that are in Belarus. And for the people that are outside of Belarus, they also face a lot of difficulties in terms of like the financial stability, finding housing, education, work, and in general, like as well, motivation. We see the dropping numbers of Belarusians wanting to go back to Belarus. We see like not a huge percentage, but there is a percentage, and it's growing, of people that would like to stay in Europe instead of going back to Belarus, because of course people have a tendency to settle down and to build their lives upon themselves. So for them, it's of course it's easier when you have, for example, found a workplace and a circle of friends. It's better for you to stay, and it's easier and safer for you to stay where you are instead of going back to the country where everything is unsafe and unstable. So for them, it's also dropping motivation. So in all of this circumstances, we also have the extremist statuses that prevent people from either joining the organizations or following the networks of extremist organizations. Rada has been recently recognized as an extremist organization, and for young people, it's now illegal to follow our social media network. So if, for example, a police worker will like take the phone away from you and will see that you are a subscriber of RADA, you can be facing 5 to 7 years in prison only for being a subscriber of the extremist social network. So for them, it's also a barrier to follow what is happening, not only inside of Belarus, but also outside of Belarus. For us, it's getting harder and harder to reach them as well. But we do have the means of contact, let's say, with them to keep them engaged, to keep them involved, not only inside of Belarus, but outside as well. And just let's say a quick comment on the percentages of our member organizations. We have 38 member organizations from different sectors, and half of them are actually inside of Belarus. By that I mean that either most of their activists are inside of Belarus, or the leaders of the organizations are inside of Belarus. So this gives us a little bit more of a better understanding of what is happening in Belarus, because we have a direct contact with them, and we do have regular meetups, catch-ups, and we also collect evidence from them on what is happening inside the country. So with this all in mind, I'll get to how we are actually managing to keep young people engaged. We do that by, first of all, educating them, providing and bridging the gap between the people that are inside and outside, because you can imagine the difference of, for example, in Belarus, they have a lack of information, and in Europe, there is a freedom of getting education, being active and developing yourself. So the gap is widening with every year, and we try to bridge this by conducting trainings, educational seminars, lectures, webinars, anything that could give a similar level of education to both the Belarusians outside and inside the country. We also conduct trainings in live manner, not only online, but we also try to bring people from Belarus to, for example, we will have a training with the Council of Europe in a couple of months, and we will also try to bring people from Belarus to be on this training, to get the motivation needed to continue their work, to get the inspiration, to also get some ideas for how to operate within the country, which is so repressive and so attentive to everything that people are doing inside the country. And we're also, it's so motivating for me to see how young people are able to come up with all these ideas and fresh new perspectives on how they can actually operate within the country, within this repressive regime, how they can come up with ideas for new projects, new initiatives, how they can mask what they're doing behind a more of an appealing picture. We've seen some examples of, for example, people conducting movie screenings, and within these movie screenings, they will dive into some deeper topics and engage more population into activism by more of a milder forms of engagement. So this would be the first track. The second track will be supporting them and caring for them, providing them with any resources that we can, be that expertise, financial support, legal support. For example, if political prisoners are living in prisons, we are trying to support them as much as possible with providing the resources for adaptation to the new context, also legal support, and psychological support as well. And the last track will be our work with international partners, advocating for Belarusians inside and outside of Belarus abroad, within this international structures such as the Council of Europe, European Union. We've recently had been a part of the consultative group within the European Union that would help us to influence the decision making on the European level on how they can actually support Belarusians and how they can influence the situation from the European perspective as well. This is also very motivator for our member organizations and for youth in general to see that we have the support from the international partners, and for them to see that it's very pleasing for them to see how much support we actually get from the international partners. And I've seen so many stories of the Belarusians that have received this motivation from just seeing, for example, like a supportive commentary on Instagram, or any kind of support that we get from the international partners, they also receive, and this is also a motivation for them to continue working. Because if you're inside of Belarus and you live in this constant fear and constant fear for your life, this is very refreshing to see the perspective from the European countries, how people react to what we do, instead of the perspective that is provided by the regime. So the encouragement here would be not only to, I would reckon Pavel on everything that he's mentioned in terms of the support, but also to adapt with this. Everyone who is committed to support in Belarus can do that by just simply expressing the support in form of words, videos, like any kind of visual representation of your support to Belarusian activists will be a tremendous help for them, because after all of these years of fighting outside of Belarus, even for me, it's getting harder and harder to retain this motivation, because we face so many difficulties. So any kind of support would be highly appreciated from our side. And today is the 9th of August, which is the commemoration of our fight for democracy. And we've had a conference of the New Belarus a couple of days ago, where we've stated all of our priorities for the next few years. One of them was, of course, to have to the European perspective and to transport this European perspective onto Belarus as well, to involve as many people as possible to create this movement of Belarusians, not only by the democratic forces, but to unite as many people as possible, to involve as many people as possible into this movement, and to have this united movement. And after all of these reflections on the conference of New Belarus, I've had just an understanding that we do have a vision for a new Belarus. We do have let's say, our goals on what kind of country we would like to build, or what kind of direction we would like to head. But it's important for us to include young people into all of these processes, into all of these contact groups, consolidated groups, coordination council, every structure that we have, to involve young people as much as possible, because we can create a vision, but to ensure that this vision will be transported onto next generations, that will be not just built, but also sustained, to ensure that this vision of New Belarus will live and will be embraced, will be developed as well with future generations to come. We need to ensure that young people are included in all these processes, not only in implementing this vision, but also in shaping this vision, to ensure that they are a huge and integral part of it. And what is also inspiring for me to see is that young people are actually very much active in all the structures of the democratic forces. In the coordination council, there is a youth, let's say, party, if we can call it this way. They are one of the most active parties within the coordination council. They're also part of the consultative group, contact group within the Council of Europe and the European Union. They're active members of all the structures that have been created by the democratic forces, and they are, let's say, the loudest ones. They are the most visible ones. They are the most active ones. And I'm very happy to see that as well, and hoping that they will be an integral part of the new Belarus that we are building together. Oh, you're muted. Sorry.
Thank you, Margaret. I just want to ask you, so, you know, the fact that I feel that you have hope for the future, that there is hope within it, though it's difficult. And what you need is actually any kind of support that can actually motivate you to continue to carry on that hope. Because actually some months ago or half a year ago, I was speaking to some young Russians who had left Russia, and they had no hope at all. And I really felt sad for them because they were without hope. But maybe you're in that sense better off because you do have some hope. And could you tell me about, you know, you tell a bit about what that hope actually relies on? Is the fact that you're included, you have active, but how about inside of Belarus? How are people? Do they have hope?
Yeah, it depends. It hugely depends on the bubble that the person is living in, because I've seen activists that are inside of Belarus that still have motivation, that still have hope for the future of Belarus, and they're very much engaged into communication with us, with any other organizations. But of course, for a person who is just like, for example, who has been an activist for a very long time and who is still in Belarus and probably surrounded by people that have less motivation and probably excluded from political processes as well, for them is, of course, harder to retain the motivation and to see that, for example, the situation in the country is not changing that much because the repressions are still there, they're still growing. And of course, it's easy to lose motivation if you don't see what is happening outside of the country. And all of the processes that the democratic forces are advocating for, and that the instruments that we have, we cannot impact the individuals in the country itself that much, because we only have the, let's say, the bigger political instruments that influence the regime itself. And the changes for the changes to actually take place in the country, and for the people to see the changes, for example, from the impact from the sanctions, from the repression on the regime as well, it will take time. And I know that it's easy for them to lose motivation if you don't see any tremendous day-to-day changes. But it's also crucial for us to understand that we are not in the position at the moment to make these day-to-day changes and to actually influence some of the day-to-day processes. But we've made a lot of progress in this year of repressing the regime, in creating more difficult circumstances for them to operate politically. And now one of the let's say one of the biggest achievements for us is also to see the amount of sanctions, how they grew over years, what we've been able to achieve over years. Maybe another point is that we're working on securing some of the day-to-day measures as well. We've been working on the strategies to release political prisoners as well. So probably this will be one of the ways for the people to see that there is an impact on their day-to-day lives as well. Another way for them to retain motivation is to, of course, probably for me, is being outside of Belarus, it's also, I do understand how they feel. And I've also felt this way about a year ago when I was still in Belarus. So I do understand how people can lose motivation, how they can lose the desire to fight. But community will probably be the answer here. The more people feel that they're not alone, the better for the motivation it is. The more they see other people acting, the easier it's for them to act as well. Probably one of the solutions would also be this movement that we are creating that would also include Belarusians that are in Belarus. So we'll try to do as much as possible, but I know that, with years, we will get harder and harder for them to retain this motivation.
Margo Varkuchava, thank you so much.
No worries.
And good luck in your work. And I hope, I really hope that there will be a solution soon to the situation in Belarus. I hope that there are cracks in Russia, so hopefully the cracks will come to Belarus as well. So good luck. So now I'd like to introduce Mogens Blicher Bjerregaard, who is former chairman of the Danish Federation of Journalists and also current chairman of the European Federation of Journalists, and is also working on journalism and free media, independent media in Belarus. So welcome, Mogens, to this webinar on where is Belarus going at the moment. Quo Vadis, Belarus.
Thank you very much. Just a little edit on my where I am now. I'm not anymore the president of the European Federation of Journalists. Today I am chair of the European Center for Press and Media Freedom, which is an European institution working for what is said, namely press and media freedom, and also having a look at Belarus. And I will say a few words about that as well. And thank you for being invited to this a very important webinar. I think that both Margo and Pavel told us why this is so extremely important, because we need the focus back on Belarus. I still have on my retina how the courageous Belarusians week after week went on the streets and how brutally they were beaten down and still are. And we need the focus outside Belarus. We need the focus on this in all countries. We just heard Marcus telling us a lot of figures that we know, but nobody knows much about them. Also because it's difficult for journalists to go to Belarus and make journalism there, because it's mostly not possible. But what can we do? And I will tell you something about what we are doing in the different organizations, and also some. I will highlight some needs that we could deal with. The European Center for Press and Media Freedom, ECPMF. We are in our program. We have a journalist in residence program, and we are hosting Belarusian journalists in exile up to 6 months. Since 2021, we have hosted 14 Belarusian journalists. We also know that none of them can return. There's no way back except directly to jail. We managed to follow up with a residence permit in Germany for some of them, if nothing else works for them. Also in a country like Czechia, one of our very committed human rights journalists managed to help 4 journalists in residence in Pilsen. We have seen some of the Belarusians being accepted as icon guests, where they can stay 2 years in so-called free cities. We actually have such one in Denmark, supporting a Belarusian icon guest. By doing this, we bring the Belarusian society or the focus on Belarus to other countries. So and the citizens in our countries know more about what happens in Belarus when we have those in exile in residence in our countries. I think it has more worth than we think about. From the European Federation of Journalists perspective, this organization have a very strong cooperation with BASH, the Belarusian Association of Journalists. We support it in many ways. The EFJ is in contact with BASH on weekly basis and has provided both solidarity, concrete financial support, and capacity building of this organization, both before and also now when they are in exile. And the European Federation of Journalists is following the big number of cases with Belarusian journalists behind bars. 35 is the latest figure I've got. And well, we just heard 1,600 political prisoners in total. And also IMS, International Media Support, based in Copenhagen, has supported both capacity building and Belarusian media in exile. And I think I could mention a lot of other organizations doing things, but of course it's not enough. Raising awareness, there are different ways of raising awareness. One of the ways we did that was last year within UNESCO, when we managed to give the award, the Guillermo Cano Prize, Press Freedom Prize, to the Belarusian Association of Journalists. I think it has a significant impact that we are doing this, and that was done because we were many organizations really fighting for this, and it was really great to see this happen when we had the World Press Freedom Conference in Uruguay. I can also mention that Nordic Journalist Center is working on Belarus items. I promised also to say something about the needs. The time is running, so I will try to be brief on those needs. At a very practical level, it should be much easier for Belarusian journalists to get visa, Schengen visa, humanitarian visa, and not least permits to stay. It is so stressful for the Belarusian when they have to move, have to re-applications for reapply every 3 months, every 6 months. Don't know what happens next. Can we stay here? And for many of them, it takes years and years and years just for instance, living in Denmark, it can take many years to get a permit here. And I was very happy to hear about the passport, the new idea about having a passport. I know Belarus journalists that are struggling now because they are running out of their passport, and it's dangerous for them to get a new passport. They have to go to one of their embassies. It can be dangerous if they go alone. This is really a challenge. So if that could be solved by having a new special passport for Belarusian citizens that could be approved by all countries, it should be approved by EU immediately. I think this is really an important task for the states to take on them, and make sure that this could happen. Then that would be a big help for Belarusians. What are they asking for, the Belarusians? Recently, and that was also quite significantly, the Council of Europe provided a closed-door workshop for Belarusian journalists and media, together with NGOs, to identify needs. And even though Belarus is not a member of Council of Europe, they managed to make this. And I also heard that Margot is going to also is in contact with the Council of Europe, which I think is very important. And at this place, they were asking for mid-career training. They were asking for twinning projects with other European media, fellowship programs, more places for residents, as I mentioned, that ECPMF and ICON are providing for. So this this is also a way for media in the rest of Europe to get more knowledge about what happens in Belarus and have more stories about Belarus, to be twinned with Belarusian exiled media or Belarusian journalists in exile. I think we should really try to do more on this. And safety is still an increasing challenge. It's important because all independent media are labeled as extremists, as we have heard and we know, which means criminal liability for people who write for media, give interviews, or just share news. Margot just told us that. Financial support for media in exile is getting more and more difficult. It's more and more difficult for those media to run without sufficient economy, because all our support goes to other countries now, not that much to Belarus anymore. We need this because companies cannot advertise in media, Belarusian media, and citizens cannot subscribe. They will all be punished if they do so. And finally, it is great that the Nordic Council of Ministers has included Belarus in their programs for the Baltic Sea area. I would strongly recommend much more cooperation among those organizations supporting Belarus journalists, media, and human rights defenders. And I find that as more you can join forces by listening to all the youth here, I think it's so important that the different groups join much more forces. If you have the cultural, all the creators, the creative sector could join forces with journalists. We have academics that are forced out of Belarus. We have scientists forced out. We have really we need to join much forces in a much larger way. So there are a lot to do, and thank you for making this webinar. It's extremely important to continue to have the focus on Belarus. Thank you.
Thank you, Mogens. And this also concludes actually the final minutes of this webinar in commemoration of the 3 years since the start of the protest movement and the fraudulent elections that Lukashenka actually, where he took the presidency away, probably, even though we will never know exactly. We have guesses to this. So thank you so much, and I hope that we'll have even more focus on Belarus in the future. Tune in on the Belarus Research Network for European Policy, in which we have different researchers providing biannual reviews of what's going on in Belarus and research papers, and probably you will learn even more about what's actually going on in Belarus. So thank you, Mogens. Thank you, Margot. Thank you, Mr. Latushka out there. So and solidarity with Belarus for the future. Yeah. Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Thank you so much.